What if the real drama in Formula One right now isn't about who's fastest, but about whether the FIA let something slip that can't be undone? Because after a closely guarded Mercedes 2026 concept was quietly exposed, several teams didn't just raise concerns, they escalated it into a formal protest against the FIA itself. Not about loopholes, about oversight. Behind the scenes, sources suggest this revelation has fractured trust between teams and regulators, with accusations that key information was known, tolerated, and only questioned once it became impossible to ignore. That's when the tension turned explosive. And here's the reason this goes far beyond Mercedes. Once you understand why teams believe the secret changes the balance of power and why the FIA is now under pressure to explain its own role, you realize this story isn't ending with a clarification. It's opening a conflict that could define how the next era of Formula One is governed. Once Mercedes' secret began circulating beyond the small circle it was meant to stay in, the reaction inside the paddock shifted almost immediately from curiosity to confrontation. This wasn't a case of rivals asking for clarification or quietly lobbying for guidance. Teams went straight to the FIA with a far more serious accusation. That something this significant should never have progressed this far without intervention. And that if it had, the responsibility didn't lie only with Mercedes. It lay with the regulator that had visibility long before the rest of the grid did. What's important here is the nature of the secret itself. This wasn't a visible aerodynamic trick or a gray area component anyone could photograph. It was a conceptual advantage. A way of interpreting the 2026 framework that affects how the entire car is designed around the power unit and energy flow. Once revealed, teams realized they weren't arguing about copying a solution. They were arguing about years of development direction that might already be obsolete. That's when frustration turned into formal action. According to sources, several teams believe Mercedes benefited not just from ingenuity, but from time. Time to explore an interpretation without resistance. Time to refine it while others followed a more conservative reading of the rules. The accusation isn't that Mercedes broke regulations. It's that the FIA may have allowed an uneven information landscape to exist for too long. And in Formula One, information asymmetry is often more powerful than outright performance. This is where the FIA finds itself in an exceptionally vulnerable position. If it admits the concept should have been addressed earlier, it opens itself to claims of negligence. If it insists everything was handled correctly, it risks alienating teams who now feel locked into inferior development paths. Either response damages trust. And trust is the one thing regulators cannot afford to lose in a cost-capped, highly politicized era. Inside technical meetings, the tone has reportedly become tense and unusually direct. Teams aren't just asking what Mercedes has done. They're asking when the FIA knew, how much it understood, and why no clearer guidance was issued. Those questions are difficult to answer cleanly, because regulatory processes are rarely designed for concepts that only reveal their full impact once others see them. By then, the damage is already perceived as done. What makes this situation explosive is that it threatens the legitimacy of the 2026 reset itself. The regulations were sold as a clean slate, a chance for convergence, a chance to prevent early runaway advantages. If teams believe that promise has already been compromised, the political consequences extend far beyond one protest. It reshapes how every future rule change will be received, with suspicion instead of optimism. And this is why the drama is still escalating rather than settling. Because the protest isn't really about forcing Mercedes to change something. It's about forcing the FIA to explain itself, to justify decisions that were once internal and procedural, but are now being examined as potentially era-defining. How the FIA responds next won't just decide the fate of one concept. It will decide whether teams still believe the rulebook is being enforced evenly, or whether this revelation has exposed a crack that can't be quietly sealed again. As the protest gains momentum, another layer of discomfort begins to surface across the grid. This isn't just about whether Mercedes found something clever. It's about whether the competitive process itself was quietly skewed long before anyone realized it mattered. Several teams now believe that even if they were shown the concept today, it would be meaningless. Not because they can't understand it, but because the window to build around it has already closed. Under a cost cap, lost time isn't something you recover with effort. It's something that permanently reshapes what's possible. What's especially damaging is the perception that this situation could have been prevented. Teams aren't arguing that the FIA should anticipate every innovation. They're arguing that once the scale of Mercedes' approach became clear internally, clearer guidance should have followed. Instead, silence prevailed. Silence that allowed one interpretation to mature in isolation while others committed elsewhere. In Formula One, silence from the regulator is often read as approval. And that assumption is now at the heart of the protest. Inside rival factories, this has triggered a sense of strategic regret that's difficult to contain. Engineers are revisiting early design decisions with the knowledge that they were made under incomplete assumptions. Not because information was hidden deliberately, but because the regulatory environment didn't signal that such a radical interpretation was even viable. That kind of regret is corrosive. It doesn't inspire innovation. It inspires political pressure. And that pressure is now being directed squarely at the FIA. There's also a growing concern about precedent. If Mercedes is allowed to retain this advantage without adjustment, it sends a clear message. That early interpretation, even if understood by the regulator, can be allowed to run unchecked until it becomes untouchable. Future teams will respond accordingly. They will push harder, earlier, and with less regard for cooperative dialogue. That's not how the FIA wants future regulation cycles to begin. But once a precedent is set, reversing that cultural shift becomes almost impossible. Within the FIA itself, this has reportedly created internal strain. Not everyone views the situation the same way. Some see the protests as politically motivated noise. Others see a genuine failure of process that risks undermining the regulator's authority. That internal divide matters, because it affects how decisively the FIA can respond. And indecision, in moments like this, only amplifies suspicion. Mercedes, meanwhile, has remained carefully measured in public. No triumphalism. No defensiveness. Just insistence that everything done was within the framework provided. That stance is technically strong, but politically fragile. Because even if Mercedes is right on paper, the perception forming around them is no longer about legality. It's about advantage gained in silence. And perception, once it hardens, becomes very difficult to unwind. Which is why this drama is far from reaching its peak. The protest has opened questions the FIA can't answer with a single clarification. Questions about transparency, about timing, about how much responsibility regulators carry when innovation accelerates faster than guidance. However this ends, it won't end cleanly. And long after the technical details fade, the memory of how this was handled will shape how teams approach every future regulation change. Because in Formula One, trust doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes one unresolved controversy at a time. As the fallout from the protest deepens, a more troubling realization begins to take hold across the paddock. This situation has exposed a fundamental vulnerability in how modern Formula One governs innovation. Not because the rules were unclear, but because their enforcement relied too heavily on discretion rather than consequence. Teams are now questioning whether compliance is enough when interpretation itself becomes the currency of advantage. If Mercedes operated within the framework but outside the shared expectations of the grid, then the problem isn't ingenuity, it's asymmetry. And asymmetry, once embedded, is almost impossible to correct without destabilizing everything around it. What intensifies the anger is the belief that this advantage didn't emerge overnight. Teams suspect it evolved quietly, through iterative validation, long before its implications became obvious. That means opportunities for the FIA to flag, question, or contextualize what was unfolding. Instead, the process moved forward in silence. That silence is now being reinterpreted not as neutrality, but as passivity. And in a sport where billions are spent chasing tenths, passivity from the regulator is indistinguishable from permission. Inside rival teams, this has triggered a recalibration that goes beyond technical response. Political strategies are being reassessed. Future cooperation with the FIA is being viewed through a more skeptical lens. Some teams are openly questioning whether transparency is still rewarded, or whether secrecy is now the only rational path. That shift in mindset is dangerous. Because when teams stop trusting the system, they stop engaging with it constructively. They start protecting themselves instead. The most uncomfortable aspect for the FIA is that there is no elegant solution left. Rolling back Mercedes' concept would invite legal challenges and accusations of arbitrary governance. Allowing it to stand without explanation entrenches the perception of favoritism or incompetence. Even issuing late clarifications risks being seen as an admission that the system failed earlier. Every available option now carries reputational damage. And the longer this drags on, the more that damage compounds. There is also a growing awareness that this protest may only be the first. If teams feel this issue is resolved unsatisfactorily, it sets a precedent for escalation. Future disputes won't stop at technical queries. They'll go straight to formal challenges, legal frameworks, and public confrontation. That's not a hypothetical risk. It's a logical outcome of eroded confidence. And the FIA knows it. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the timing. The 2026 regulations were supposed to represent a reset not just technically, but politically. A chance to rebuild trust after years of controversy. Instead, this revelation threatens to reopen old wounds under a new technical banner. If teams enter the next era believing the reset was compromised before it began, the legitimacy of the entire cycle is called into question. And legitimacy, once lost, is far harder to recover than competitive balance. This is why the story cannot settle yet. Because the protest isn't simply a reaction to what Mercedes achieved. It's a response to how the system allowed it to happen unnoticed for so long. How the FIA answers that accusation will define more than one season. It will define whether teams believe the rules are a shared foundation, or just a starting point for whoever is willing to push the furthest in silence. As the pressure continues to build, the situation begins to take on a far more systemic character. What teams are now questioning isn't just a single decision or a missed intervention. They're questioning whether the FIA's current model is even capable of managing innovation at this scale anymore. Because when concepts are no longer physical parts but interconnected systems, oversight becomes less visible and far more subjective. That subjectivity is where trust starts to erode. If teams believe that some interpretations are quietly tolerated while others are unknowingly discouraged, the foundation of competitive fairness starts to feel negotiable rather than fixed. One of the most damaging consequences of this episode is the way it reframes past interactions with the FIA. Teams are now re-examining old technical directives, ambiguous responses, and unanswered questions through a different lens. What once looked like neutral restraint now looks like selective silence. And even if that perception is unfair, it's powerful. Because perception shapes behavior. Teams are already discussing whether future innovations should be disclosed at all, or protected until they are too embedded to challenge. That alone signals a breakdown in cooperative governance. Inside Mercedes rivals, frustration has begun to shift into something colder and more calculated. This is no longer about outrage. It's about adaptation. If the lesson from this episode is that early, aggressive interpretation carries little downside, teams will adjust accordingly. They'll push further, earlier, and with less transparency. Not because they want to destabilize the sport, but because the incentive structure now appears to reward silence over dialogue. That is exactly the dynamic the 2026 regulations were meant to prevent. For the FIA, this is the most dangerous inflection point. Because once teams stop believing that early disclosure leads to fair outcomes, regulatory authority weakens rapidly. The FIA can enforce rules. It can issue clarifications. But it cannot easily rebuild trust once teams feel exposed by playing openly. That's why the handling of this protest matters more than its technical outcome. It will signal whether openness is still valued or whether survival now depends on secrecy. There is also the question of accountability within the FIA itself. If internal processes fail to escalate the significance of Mercedes' concept, where does responsibility lie? With individual technical delegates? With committees? With governance structures that were designed for a slower, more visible form of innovation? These are uncomfortable questions, and they rarely get answered publicly. But inside the sport, they are being asked with increasing urgency. And unanswered questions have a habit of resurfacing at the worst possible moments. What makes this drama especially volatile is that there is no natural resolution point. No race result can settle it. No single clarification can undo years of perceived advantage. Whatever decision the FIA reaches will be seen as either too late or too weak by someone. That guarantees lingering resentment. And lingering resentment doesn't fade quietly. It reshapes alliances, voting blocs, and political strategies long after the original issue fades from headlines. This is why the situation remains unresolved, and deliberately so. Because the real battle isn't over Mercedes' secret. It's over whether Formula One can still govern innovation without fracturing trust. How the FIA responds now will echo into every future regulation change, every early concept, every moment where a team asks itself whether to speak up or stay silent. And if the answer increasingly becomes silence, then this episode won't be remembered as a single controversy. It will be remembered as the moment the balance between regulation and competition quietly shifted with consequences no one could fully control afterward.